I don't think it's any mystery that the progressive left doesn't respect freedom of speech. It's embedded in every level of their ideology, from their politically correct language policing, to their shouting down of dissident opinions, to their assertion that hate speech is, in fact, not free speech. But when accused of this, the typical response I usually hear from the left is, well, no one's preventing you from speaking. Free speech just means that the government can't arrest you for expressing yourself. You aren't free from the consequences of your words. This is an argument that I call Strawman freedom of speech, because it demonstrates to me a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of the progressive left what free speech actually is. But, at the same time, I honestly can't blame them, because the way that the concept of free speech gets taught in a lot of American high schools is in a very limited context. Indeed, in my high school experience, the only time freedom of speech was ever mentioned was in my U.S. government and politics class, in the context of the First Amendment. And I think that this can lead to a very myopic and ultimately flawed understanding of free speech. So what I want to do with this video is not to go on a tirade about how the left is destroying this most basic freedom, but to clear up what I believe are simply some common misconceptions about it. What interests me the most about this straw man is how progressives assume that freedom of speech only means that you can't be penalized by the government for expressing yourself, or that it somehow only includes the right to criticize the government without legal recourse. But if they were even remotely aware of how free speech works or how the government works, they would know that that's not what free speech means. That's what the First Amendment means. While it's true that the authors of the Bill of Rights wrote the First Amendment to ensure that citizens would be able to criticize the government, the First Amendment doesn't say, Congress shall grant the people the freedom to criticize the government, but all other forms of speech are subject to congressional approval. It says, Congress shall make no law, I repeat, no law, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The language of the First Amendment implies that freedom of speech is something that exists independently of the government, something that can neither be given nor taken away by the state. In other words, it is inherent to a free society. It is a right. The purpose of the First Amendment, and of the Bill of Rights as a whole, was not to give rights, it was to preserve them. It was to ensure that the American people would be free to express themselves in whatever way they chose. And that includes hate speech. That includes Holocaust denial. That includes the most vile and disagreeable statements ever to be uttered by a human. Without this freedom, how would we be able to call out bad ideas when we see them? How would we be able to put forth our own ideas when they need to be heard? How would we be able to arrive at the truth about anything? The truth isn't always popular. I would say it seldom is, in fact. Galileo was persecuted by the Catholic Church for his study of planetary bodies. Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, was laughed at by the scientific community when he first presented his studies on pea plants. Charles Darwin was initially dismissed out of hand when he published On the Origin of Species. Can you imagine where we'd be today in our knowledge about the natural universe if these men and their ideas had been silenced? Can you imagine what kind of world we'd be living in if the abolitionists, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement hadn't spoken up? Freedom of speech isn't just relegated to criticizing the government, it's the ability to express ideas and opinions of any and all stripes. We don't protect unpopular or, God forbid, bigoted speech because we want to or because we agree with it, it's because we have to. We have to uphold everyone's freedom to express themselves so that censorship doesn't get turned on the good ideas as well as the bad. And what the progressive left fails to understand is that censorship doesn't come exclusively from the government. There are other, subtler means of silencing opinions, which I'll demonstrate with a hypothetical scenario. Suppose you have 10 people in a room, and all 10 are asked to give their opinion on a certain issue. If all 10 people have a unique opinion on this issue that doesn't align with anyone else's opinion, then freedom of speech is when you get 10 different answers to the question. But what would be the opposite of that? What would be the antithesis of free speech? Well, it would be if all 10 people have different opinions, but they're made to express the same opinion. Free speech is threatened when people are pressured into expressing an opinion they don't hold, or into not expressing any opinion at all. And when that pressure works, then you have no free speech at all. It's that pressure that alarms me. That pressure might not strip you of your free speech, but it threatens to stamp it out in an attempt to silence your voice. And that pressure can come from a lot of places. Legal recourse, threats of violence, shame from your peers, perhaps? I've seen too much of this pressure come to the surface of our public discourse in recent years, and it takes form in words, in policy, even in acts of terror. One of the most heinous assaults on free speech was the Charlie Hebdo massacre 2 years ago. I'm sure that most of you know the story already, but for those who don't, in January 2015, 2 jihadist gunmen infiltrated the headquarters of the French political satire magazine Charlie Hebdo, which had recently printed cartoons defaming the Prophet Muhammad. The gunmen killed 12 and injured 11 in their crusade to avenge the Prophet. According to them, it was a most abominable crime to even depict the Prophet, much less insult him in such a grotesque portrayal, and this meant that the violent murder of those responsible was completely justified. And all of a sudden, while people from all over France and all over the world were rallying in solidarity behind Charlie Hebdo and in resistance to theocratic encroachment on free society, banners emblazoned with the slogan Je suis Charlie or I am Charlie, the regressive left came out of the woodworks with the slogan Je ne suis pas Charlie, I am not Charlie, somehow trying to apologize for the murder of cartoonists and trying to make it appear as though this were an issue about protecting the religious sensibilities of Muslims and not about free speech in the slightest. No, it was about free speech, and I'll tell you why if none of you disgusting regressive twats have gotten it by now. Those gunmen weren't trying to convince the cartoonists that the Prophet and the religious feelings of Muslims were deserving of respect. They weren't putting forth any ideas of their own to change the hearts and minds of Charlie Hebdo. They were trying to silence them. They were trying to silence everyone by striking fear into their hearts, by threatening that it would happen again if their faith continued to be ridiculed. They did not argue that their faith be respected, they demanded it, providing no reason for why anyone should do so. And now imagine that no one had spoken up and proclaimed, Je suis Charlie. Imagine if everyone had remained silent, had gone through life never condemning the actions of these religious radicals and never insulting the Prophet again out of fear for their lives. Their free speech would have been as dead as the cartoonists who had died defending it. This is, in itself, a very obvious tautology. When no one speaks, there is no speech. And now we can see how the religious violence of jihadists and the ideological bullying of the social justice movement really aren't so different after all. Authoritarian leftism, much like the scare tactics of radical Islamism, is nothing more than an attempt to halt discourse, to have complete domination over the way society thinks and talks. Express any politically incorrect opinion. Black Lives Matter does more harm than good for actual black lives. Feminism isn't in the best interest of women. Hillary Clinton wasn't the right candidate to be president. People of color are not an oppressed class. And you will be shamed. You will be shouted down. Progressives don't engage with your ideas. They don't argue against them or lay down any reasons for why their position is correct. Their first line of attack is to shout bigot at the first sign of disagreement. And then the conversation grinds to a jarring halt. I mean, really, think about it. If you share your opinion and someone calls you a racist, where are you supposed to go from there? They've said nothing about your argument, they've only tried to smear your character, forcing you to defend yourself from the accusation and completely deflecting the conversation away from the actual topic that was being debated in the first place. The irony of Francesca's argument here,
similar to the new term social justice warrior, calling someone PC is a way to derail and dismiss conversations about inequality,
is that she doesn't seem to be aware that the only thing derailing the conversation is political correctness itself. The people who scream racist at every turn haven't tried to convince you that their ideas are valid, they've just tried to shut you up. They've tried to keep your voice out of the public square. They've tried to take away your speech. And if that's all they could do to counter you, then it becomes clear to those of us with 2 brain cells to rub together that their argument probably couldn't have held up on its own, and that the attempted character assassination is probably unfounded. But they don't need to argue, you see, it's the current year. Their opinions should be the only opinions, and if you haven't accepted them by now, then you need to go back to the racist backwoods hick town you came from.
Some positions simply cannot be entertained, let alone argued against. There is this fallacy on the left around reasoned debate. Don't assault and boycott racists and misogynists. Debate with them. Don't go low, go high. Be better. But why? Why should we be better? Just for the sake of being better? Or because being better produces results?
This is arrogance at its finest. This is a line of thinking with the intellectual rigor of an impetuous 5-year-old throwing a temper tantrum. The progressive left doesn't want to change minds, they only want compliance, and they'll shame you into silence so that they can get their way. But no matter how stridently you disagree with these authoritarian busybodies, no matter how much you stick to the courage of your convictions, no matter if you're motivated and impassioned by being a wayward, ideological vagabond fighting against a sea of people trying to drown your voice out, you're only human, and shame is a powerful tool. Even in a world of bloodthirsty religious zealots, I honestly believe that social justice is the more sinister threat to our freedom of speech. While threats of violence from authoritarian regimes have always bred valiant resistance and brave dissidents, social justice is a different kind of animal. It comes not with the despotic, malicious tyranny of a Stalin or a Hitler, but with a smile, saying, "Come with me, and I will show you how to live a good and virtuous life." There's no bad guy to point to in social justice as there was in the case of Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. It's so easy for people to latch onto it, to make themselves feel good about fighting for a cause and being the moral superior in society. And when they shame you because you don't buy into their narrative, when someone tries to make you feel morally deficient, when your peers ostracize you from the group, it's our first instinct to make that stop, and to prevent it from happening if it hasn't already. Humans crave group approval. It's an instinct from our evolutionary past when strong, cohesive in-groups were our one-way ticket to survival, which I detail extensively in this video right here if you want to learn more about how that works. It's just a facet of human nature. Our brains want to comply to group pressure, to avoid shaming and excommunication. It will tell us to stay silent if our opinion is unpopular. That's why we have to stay vigilant and overcome our instincts. We have to continue to exercise our right to free speech and call out bad ideas where we see them. We have to be courageous and never be afraid to speak up. If we don't, then we may never be able to again.